Welcome to China Rising. I'm Sarah Xu. Today I'm here with Dr. Neil O'Connor to discuss the effects of the U.S.-China trade war and the coronavirus on global supply chains. Professor Neil O'Connor is the head of department and a professor of accounting and finance at Monash University, Malaysia. He's one of the foremost experts on technology and innovation in manufacturing in China. Dr. O'Connor has spent 18 years in Hong Kong, where he researched the modernization processes of Chinese firms, examining issues such as performance measurement, order qualification, and trust. He has previously taught at the Hong Kong Baptist University, City University of Hong Kong, the University of Hong Kong, and the National University of Singapore. So thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Great to be on board.
So what are some of the supply chain disruptions that you have seen as a result of the U.S.-China trade war and now the coronavirus?
It's a very good question. I'm in academia, but I've spent a lot of time visiting factories, auditing factories, interviewing thousands of suppliers, especially focused on China when I was in Hong Kong. And the question about the trade war, the coronavirus, they're actually putting two different forces on the global supply chain. But from what I saw, and not what I read, in terms of the factories I visited in China during 2018, 2019, the specific industry I really focused on was the electronics industry. The sales to SMEs, which were their major customers, fell off a cliff in 2019 because of the trade war. And what these factories in China were doing, most of them are in Shenzhen, the ones I visited, they couldn't get enough orders. Some of them, well, they had the flexibility because they had already outsourced their labor contracts. That's another innovation that they're doing along the way. But they were trying to sell direct on Amazon themselves. Now, there is a lot of factories in China that are very successful in selling on Amazon, but those that were forced to in 2019, they had challenges in going onto Amazon because, yes, they could get a product on Amazon, but whenever there was a complaint or there was some customer wanted some follow-up or feedback or questions, they didn't have the wherewithal to actually follow up and do customer service. And some of these factories got blacklisted on Amazon just because of their poor customer service, not because their products were bad in any way. So what I could say from my direct contacts with the factories in China is that they are learning, and a lot of them have got it right, but a lot of them are still learning this going direct to the consumer in the West. And the trade war has actually forced them to do this, more of them to do this, whereas 2 or 3, 4 years ago, less of them had to go direct to the customer in other countries. And I've been to another factory where they made hoverboards. So I was doing 600 order one day for a French customer. And I said, "You worried about trade war?" I said, "No, all of our customers, we're just targeting Europe, the Middle East." And they were just happy to send out their goods to their non-USA customers. And I wouldn't say it was the perfect quality. It was more of a workshop. It wasn't the best quality hoverboards that they were making. But the trade war didn't affect a lot of these types of factories, the workshops. But the serious factories that I've visited that have all the systems in place, the quality systems and things like that, they were affected by the trade war to a greater extent, but they will survive because they are larger and they can weather that storm.
That's interesting. So based on what you've seen, what are the factors that have played into supply chain disruption? Is it insufficient production or breaks in the logistics chain, changes in the end user from firms to households, excessive cost, or other factors?
The trade war, first and foremost, it just changed the cost equation for export. It changed the cost equation for the supply chain, especially those factories and those importers focused on USA. It didn't necessarily change the cost equation for those that were focused on the Middle East and Europe and Africa and other parts of Asia. Now, US is not the only market in the world, and so there's plenty of 200 other countries that the Chinese factories are selling to. So a lot of them would just stop selling USA and then go straight to another country. So the cost was a big thing for the trade war. It just imposed cost on both sides. It didn't cost the factory more, but the cost was borne by the importer in USA. And so as a result, the importer, those that had more power, they tried to force the cost back on the factories in China. And so if the importer was large enough, with enough volume, they could go back to the factory in China and say, look, we need to wear this 10% increase or 25% increase in the tariff together. Otherwise, we cannot order from you in a sustainable way. So that was a big effect of the trade war. And the multinationals, they dealt with that no problem, because their supply chain is not just China. Their supply chain is all over the world. You take Apple and all these other large multinationals. The effect of the tariffs is dissipated. Apple's value add through Foxconn is only about 5% in total. Like, that's kind of like the labor cost that's added on to the cost of making the latest iPhone. The latest iPhone costs about 400 plus in bill of materials, and not all of that is added on China. There's a whole supply chain all around the world that goes into that. So it's not like you take the cost of the iPhone, multiply that by 10%, and then that's how much the extra tariff is. It's only on those portions of the bill of materials and the value added that is coming in from China. As I said, the multinationals can dissipate that cost because the supply chains from all over the world. In terms of the coronavirus, that effect in terms of on the supply chain was different. It wasn't directly the cost. It was more in terms of getting stuff from A to B. Now, first of all, it is actually getting things produced in China, because China, starting in January, and for the most of January up until Chinese New Year, was virtually on lockdown. And so labor wouldn't go to factories. The factories couldn't have labor and they couldn't make anything. And even after Chinese New Year, you're going into February and you're going into late February, and then the China's saying, okay, we need to get back to work. So not everyone could come back to the factory. And if there was key people that was needed to operate certain machines, and they were still stuck in Wuhan because that was still locked down, although other places weren't, then the whole factory couldn't run efficiently. So the coronavirus had effect on the physical movement of labor in China. And then, of course, that had a ripple effect on then the distribution of final goods to countries around the world, and not just USA. So the coronavirus had a totally different effect from the trade war. But I would say, on a positive note, I just don't want to be all doom and gloom here, but the trade war has brought to the attention of boards of directors around the world of companies that have global supply chains of the need to be aware of where is your supply chain and where are the different costs in your supply chain. It's just brought to the boardroom table. What do we do about the tariffs if they come in? Do we delay investment? Do we pull the trigger? Often the trade war has just created a massive uncertainty for companies around, especially out of USA, in terms of, do we continue to expand in China, or do we expand in our second or third country that we are already in? For the large companies. For other companies, the trade wars force boards of directors to say, well, do we move from China to another country? So in some ways, the trade wars created uncertainty in that way, and in a good way, it's forced boards of directors of companies, senior management, to think about how resilient is their supply chain to different regulations and different government effects. And so now the coronavirus has come along, totally a black swan from a totally different angle. It wasn't created by the US government, as some people are saying, but it's there. And so now I think company senior management, they're in a better position to deal with it than they were probably 4 years ago, before the trade war even came, because they were forced to think about, well, sorry, the actual sourcing globally and selling globally, it's not just a piece of cake anymore. And so the corona is just one more thing that is added to the uncertainty equation. And it's one more thing that's added to, well, hang on, the Trump administration has imposed a cost on us sourcing from China. Well, hang on, now the corona has actually imposed another cost in a different way. It's actually delayed everything. And maybe we can bear the cost of a tariff, but we cannot bear the cost of delays. And it's just increased this uncertainty. And for those non-big multinationals, the medium-sized enterprises, they're obviously going to pull the trigger to say, well, we probably need to move out of China. We probably need to redesign products that have less parts from China. Having said that, it's still going to take a couple of years to properly shift production to another country if they're not already in another country, to get up and running and fully certified and everything like that for export back to the USA. So, yeah, it's been a double whammy, but in different ways.
I see. That's a great explanation. So, just following up on what you were just mentioning about companies thinking about diversifying outside of China, have you seen a lot of U.S. or other companies moving out of China already? And I guess that you would probably answer this in a positive way, but do you think this is going to be a permanent trend? Even when the trade war is over, will supply chains continue to diversify?
It's very interesting. There's what I've seen and speaking to executives, and of course, there's a lot of what I've read out there. So I'm not going to repeat about what I've read. Yes, there are many, many stories of major brand names moving out of China. And this is what has been read. So I don't want to say that this is my own experience. Like you talk about Crocs, shoes, Yeti beer coolers, Romba vacuums, GoPro cameras. They have all been reported in the popular press of moving out of China. But here's what I know when I talk to executives about their actual experience of moving from China. Several years ago, there was this Swiss company that were making those international travel adapters. Those adapters where you travel, you got different points that come out of it that go into different power sockets in different countries. And so I was talking to the executive there, and they actually moved out of China to Thailand. But when I asked them, why did you move? Well, was it just for costs? And the executive said, no, there was three reasons. One was for costs. The labor costs in China were going up. So we went to Thailand. We thought we'd have a little bit more control over that. Number two was the concerns over IP protection, and they just felt that. I said, how do you have that concern? We said, well, we're in Guangzhou and we get about 2 million hits on our website in Guangzhou, and most of the hits are coming from addresses in Guangzhou. Most of our customers are not in Guangzhou. And so obviously you have would-be factories that want to get their designs and copy them and make them. And of course, okay, you go to Thailand, yes, you can still go to the website and look for the designs, but they just want an extra barrier of protection in terms of that IP theft or by other potential competitors. And the third reason was they wanted more transparency. They just weren't comfortable with the amount of transparency with kickbacks and different things like that that was going on at the time. So I met the same executive 6 months later after they moved to Thailand. I said, how's the move? And he said, oh, the Bangkok government just put up labour costs by 40%.
Wow.
So what do you learn from that? And it's a big thing I tell a lot of buyers, well, at the executives, at the SME and higher levels is, do not move for one factor alone. You need to move for more than one factor. Political, IP, costs, or a good supply chain, or it's the ecosystem. You don't just move for costs alone. Labour costs are going up everywhere. You go to Vietnam, yes, of course the labour costs are lower, but in 5 years' time, they're going to be up another 50% or more, or even double. It's going to happen everywhere. So you don't move for costs alone. You don't just move for regulation alone. You've got to have a combination. You need to be strategic in thinking about where you move. And one of the reasons why a lot of companies I talk to, they're still in China, is because of the ecosystem. It's not because of the costs. Well, in the end, you go to another country that doesn't have the ecosystem, it's going to cost you more. But I mean, it's the supplier ecosystem. It's the materials, the material suppliers that you're able to call on and get 100,000 units of something in 5 days or 2 weeks notice. And you go to another country, suddenly you're waiting for a month or more because you may have to import some materials. For a multinational, that is the last thing that they would consider. You drop one country and go to another. It's more about shifting of percentages of their portfolio so they could sort of better optimize the risk of their multi-country position in terms of where they are sourcing, what they are sourcing, how they are sourcing. I talked to one executive from VF Corp, wouldn't mind me mentioning, and I asked, what's your biggest challenge? And they said it's the cost of time.
Oh, wow.
You know, we import the lowest cost jeans from Mexico into USA because it's easy with the low skilled labor to make the 5-pocket variety jeans, but we still import our good designs, our new designs from China because they have much more skilled labor. Now that may have changed more recently, but there's a greater sense of strategy in thinking about where the multinational source from.
That makes sense. So do you think that supply chains will recover after the trade war and coronavirus pandemic are over? And how soon might that happen?
This partly answers this question about, you know, is this going to be a permanent trend? Okay, there's going to be a hit to the footprint that multinational companies and SMEs have with sourcing from China, especially because smaller companies have decided to hit the trigger and say, okay, we're moving to Vietnam or India, Taiwan, Malaysia. Okay, the multinationals, they will continue to see their countries where they source as a portfolio, and they may just have a smaller percentage in sourcing from China. What you got to realize is that the difference between an SME and a multinational, for a large part, is that multinational has less risk because it's spread over other countries, but you got to also realize that multinationals potentially have higher risk because they have larger volumes to source. So when they go to a supplier or to a new factory in a new country, they're asking that factory, you know, I want to make 100,000 units a month. Or, you know, talking about a smartphone manufacturer, they're talking about 10 million units a month. Apple's even double that. So the volumes are ginormous in some product sectors. Okay, electronics, smartphone manufacturing, like China is still going to have the monopoly there because it's got the ecosystem. Automobile manufacturing, China is still going to be the monopoly there because of the ecosystem again. Honda has just opened up a new factory in Chongqing. They're already in Wuhan and other parts of China. So my point is that, okay, it depends if the company is large or small, but also it depends, and very large, you depend to a greater extent on a specific ecosystem of the country that you are sourcing from. And the other thing I've just mentioned there, just to round that up, post-COVID, it's going to be totally different from industry to industry. We can go further and talk about, well, how's that going to affect the medical industry and things like that.
So based on what you've seen, which firms are dealing the best with these types of disruptions? And are there examples of companies that have sufficiently flexible practices to keep up with these production changes?
I think all companies have been given there's been a shot across the bow yes, they're all taking a hit. All companies are taking a hit because of not just the supply side, but the demand side. And you're not going to see growth year on year in many companies around the world across most sectors, probably except medical sector.
Right.
And so that hit is going to ring large bells among boards of directors and senior management. And as a result, they're going to increasingly need to think about having a continuing expert, a continuing part of their organization that is focusing on dealing with disruptions to the supply chain, dealing that are a result of these once in 100-year, or if you talk about natural disasters, once in a year events. And not all companies have that in place. And so as what happened in the last 15 years, where a lot of the companies that have a sizable reputation through the stock market or through their brand they've got someone in charge of sustainability, a C-level person in charge of that. Well, you're going to see companies increasingly having a C-level person in charge of looking forward and thinking and testing the company's supply chain resilience to these events. And I think that's the big thing that's going to happen post-COVID.
Nice. Well, let's go ahead and stop there. That was extremely lucid and informative. And I want to thank Dr. Neil O'Connor for being with us to talk about the effects of the U.S.-China trade war and coronavirus on global supply chains. And I think the main takeaway is that the firms that are most resilient, that are the most diversified, and that are dealing with this at a senior level will be able to survive these types of disruptions going forward. So thank you, Dr. O'Connor.
Oh, my pleasure, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thanks.